Good evening. Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Göran Eriksson, Vice Mayor of Culver City. And before we start, if you have any questions about our programs and following programs that are coming up or ideas, talk to Ashley. She's the one that's putting all this together. So thank you, Ashley. So, today we have a very exciting speaker who also is a Culver City resident since many, many years. So it's Kevin Klowden, who is the Executive Director of the Milken Institute Center for Regional Economics and California Center. So Milken Institute is down in Santa Monica. I don't know if you've been there. They have free presentations and seminars. So everything is not... We don't have to pay for everything there, doing free stuff down there. Very interesting speakers, actually. I've done that once in a while. So he's specialized in the study of key factors that underlie the development of competitive regional economics and how these are influenced by public policy and in turn affect the regional economy. On a national level, he's heavily involved in issues of capital access for small businesses, including serving as chair of the U.S. Department of Commerce Trade Finance Advisory Council. Kevin is producing a lot of books and reports, so he has been the lead author of strategies for expanding California's export. He's been involved in further work. Here is a golden opportunity with China, how California can become an even bigger destination for Chinese foreign investment. And a number of others, and he also contributed to opinion pieces in Wall Street Journal. In addition, he is also the author of several studies on the economics of the entertainment industry, which is for us really interesting. So a few of his works there is New Skills at Work, Keeping Los Angeles at the Cutting Edge of an Evolving Industry, a Hollywood exit, what California must do to remain competitive in entertainment and keep jobs, and many, many more. So Kevin is a frequent speaker on state fiscal issues and has served on multiple advisory boards on business growth, economic development, and infrastructure. He holds graduate degree from University of Chicago and London School of Economics. And today, we have him all for ourselves. So and today, what we're gonna delve into is what is Culver City's role within the regional economy, and he will talk about this and talk about trends, challenges, and other issues, and hopefully give us some idea how he sees this develops over the years. So, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Mayor. Thank you to all of you for being here. I will go through, I have a certain number of slides. I have plenty of off-the-cuff remarks I will make to go along with them, and I will be more than happy to answer questions afterwards. One of the things to keep in mind is that Culver City is in an interesting situation that's evolved over time in terms of its relationship with the LA economy. For those of you who are familiar with Culver's history, when it first started out, it was basically a den of vice and iniquity. It was the freestyle, free-willing city that almost anything went in, especially during the early days and even into Prohibition. But really, Culver City was built around being part of the larger economy. And I always joke that in the end, that Culver City really developed around three people: Harry Culver, who was really involved in real estate and viewed things from that lens; Howard Hughes, because Howard Hughes not only had RKO Pictures here, but also had Hughes Aircraft out in Playa Vista on the West Edge; and a guy by the name of Louis Mayer, because Louis Mayer, he was the longtime head of MGM, and for a long time, MGM was the largest employer in Culver City. And in fact, when Culver City had its economic downturn in the 1980s, where downtown degraded and various other things happened, it was largely because of the decline of the fortunes of MGM. For those of you who may or may not remember, When Ted Turner bought MGM, he over-leveraged himself to do so. Ironically, I know the guy who helped arrange the financing for that, but that's a different story. And what happened was that Turner realized he has overextended himself, so he split the company into three pieces. He sold MGM back to Kirk Kerkorian, the guy who's best known now for having made a whole bunch of casinos in Vegas, and he sold the lot to a company called Lorimar, which made the TV show Dallas, and he kept the film library, which turned out to make him really, really rich. And that was a great decision for him, but for Culver City, it was a problem. And it was a problem for basically more than a decade until Sony Pictures came in, bought the lot, bought Columbia Pictures, moved Columbia Pictures to Culver City, and created a situation where today that Culver City's largest employer is still Sony, between not only the film industry and they consolidated their music operations here. But the other thing it's worth remembering, is that Culver City was built on a diversified economy. It's not always just entertainment. And for those of you who have fought through the crowds to, stock up at Costco recently, and sometimes wonder why in the heck is Costco technically in Culver City, and the answer was because as part of the weird annexation patterns of Culver City, that lot at one time was a Hughes aircraft plant and was in fact a helicopter plant. And so Culver City has been tied into a number of different industries and a number of different aspects of the larger economy for a very long time. And so when you look at it, and you look at it in the overall economy, is that there's employment in industry, there's the tax structure and revenues. How well does Culver City do in attracting revenues, spending, local businesses, housing and rental costs, which of course are the ones that everybody here dreads and lives with all the time, regional road traffic, which goes along with that, the public transportation network, and then last I'll talk a little bit about opportunity zones, which in some ways is more topical because when Jerry Brown was trying to balance the state budget in the wake of all the fiscal problems that he inherited, he got rid of redevelopment. And so we're really looking at what could be done in lieu of that, and opportunity zones are one of the things that have come up more recently, largely because the tool that was created to go instead of redevelopment, the enhanced infrastructure financing districts, nobody knows how to use, which is a bit of an issue. They're trying to get around to it now, but it's kind of a problem. Anyway, so you look at the regional geography where basically the big purple area is Culver City with a line sort of going through it that's Bologna Creek. And you look at this odd geography and you think about it, that Culver City is really wedged between a whole bunch of different things. As I said, there's some different kind of annexations that happened along the way, the last major one of which was the Fox Hills area. And that's created a number of different factors driving it. You have, obviously, retail, including what was the old Fox Hills Mall that Westfield renovated. You've got a number of retail and restaurants, especially that serve the Sony Pictures area in downtown, and have become very successful. You have different older, aging retail corridors along Sepulveda Boulevard and Washington and Culver and so on. And more broadly, Culver City is stuck by the fact that it's right in the middle of a lot. For those of you who are very aware that Sepulveda Boulevard and Overland can get horrifically busy, if you're sometimes, Venice Boulevard, especially as you go east. There are various other pitfalls that come with the fact that if you look at a map more broadly, you realize that a few of the longest streets in Los Angeles all go through Culver City. Not only Sepulveda, not only Jefferson, but Slauson and Washington and Venice and so on. And it's kind of crazy. And so this means that Culver City is utterly linked to the regional geography. And it means that Culver City has in many ways constantly struggled to figure out how does it interact. Is it a place of calm, constantly going around and trying to tout itself as Mayberry? And yes, not only because Andy Griffith was filmed in Hayden Tract, but that ultimately is part of it, is that it's this idea of what's the identity of Culver City. And as all of you are aware, that sort of middle income, middle America kind of feel has been severely pressured In fact, not even by the economic developments in the city, but by those around it. As Playa Vista, which was, one time the aircraft factory, which got torn down, got replaced more recently by a significant number of technology-based developments, technology, software, and so on, and Silicon Beach came to be. One of the things that particularly became significant is that the employers in Culver City, as we'll talk about, weren't the only defining factors of the local economy. If you look at the principal employers, you say that, there's a city labor, total city labor force of 24,688 based on these established companies and who these main employers are. But in fact, a lot more people actually go in and out of Culver City to work than this number, a significant number more. Even though it's Sony Pictures, and then you've got the various the usuals. You've got a couple hospitals, you have the Unified School District, you have West LA College, you have the city as an employer, you've got a variety of others. But really, the main thing that's become significant in defining Culver City is not only the employers who are there, but the number of employers who are looming around the area, how that's affecting demand, traffic patterns, and otherwise. And one of the things in particular that made the news recently in terms of Culver City is the fact that you suddenly had the rise of a significant number of local employers who are adding jobs. So for those of you who have been watching, once upon a time there was this lovely little restaurant supply place called Surface, which has moved way east. Surface got replaced by what was supposed to be the HBO headquarters, the HBO West headquarters. And then HBO went through the merger that was going on with its parent company, with Time Warner and AT&T, and they said, well, we're backing off. And Apple said, well, thank you, and took it instead. So HBO is now going, now that things are settled, is now going to move into the building right next to the train station. And so you add that with the fact that all the redevelopment going on at Culver Studios, which is adding Amazon jobs, and you have the fact that everybody's favorite child and teen-friendly little video app, TikTok, has its U.S. headquarters in Culver City and is hiring significantly. So TikTok's projected to add up to 1,000 jobs, Amazon 2,400 jobs, HBO 750 jobs, Apple nearly 1,600 jobs. That's a lot of jobs for a small town. And that's a lot of high-paying jobs. And if you look at Culver City and you look at the jobs, strangely enough, waste management is a big employer. You can say what you want about that. But the fact is that if you look at information as the number one and professional services as number three, you realize that Culver City is proportionately very much driven by technology. It's very much driven by professional jobs that relate to technology. It's related to software. It's related to the entertainment industry. It's related to online apps. It's related to a whole bunch of different things, not just in the city, but down over, for those of you who are familiar with the Hughes Center, where the Cinemark theaters are, that has a number of other related companies there. Playa Vista, we've talked about, all of the various places in Silicon Beach. And the fact is we'll get into, there's not enough housing, particularly family-oriented housing, for the people who've been moving in for those jobs. And it is significantly affecting Culver City. It's affecting Culver City's overall economy. And in many ways, what you're seeing happening to Culver City is an issue that ties in with the jobs and the value of those jobs. For those of you who are very familiar with it, and I'll get into this, you look at Santa Monica. Santa Monica officially has a higher resident population than the number of jobs. It has nearly 100,000 people, tons and tons of rental units, and supposedly around 80,000 jobs. But the jobs in Santa Monica fundamentally transformed. Once upon a time, Santa Monica was like Culver City in that it was very heavily tied to aviation. Santa Monica was home to Douglas Aircraft. People who lived in Santa Monica tended to be willing to do a longer commute. And what happened was that when the freeway came in, suddenly people were like, wow, I can live by the beach and work downtown. And it massively drove up Santa Monica's property values. But then what happened was that when the recession of the 90s happened, Santa Monica was like, we're going to do a lot of mixed-use developments in the old warehouse district on Colorado and Olympic Boulevards. And Santa Monica transformed because suddenly that area, after the recession ended and the dot-com bubble happened, became a major technology and entertainment employment center. As a matter of fact, it's never really stopped. And Santa Monica added an incentive in there where they offered business municipal broadband. And that's really where Silicon Beach comes from in a lot of ways. It spread down into Venice. You had the Google development where they took over the old digital domain and Chiat Day advertising space. You have a number of other employers who've moved in. You've got various groups like Riot Games and others who all moved into this space. But that spread to Culver City. For those of you who are familiar with the Symantec building, for those of you who are familiar with a number of other technology companies around the fringes, it's a big deal. And for Culver City, what's really important to look at it is that you look at the employment numbers that are up here. So you look at that and you say, if you look at the workers employed relative to the population and you suddenly say, wow, 55,000, and you realize that the official job numbers don't necessarily reflect the reality. And Santa Monica, as I said, has massively been transformed by the number of jobs in and around the city, and the number of jobs in Westwood, the number of jobs in the whole area. And if you look at the fact that Westside Pavilion is basically being converted into a Google campus, if you look at the overall concentrations, this is creating a number of infrastructure issues. It's creating a number of demands that are transforming the area. They've already driven up housing and rental prices. They've already created a number of issues in terms of traffic. And what's significant and important about it is, in many ways, what Culver City is facing and what Culver City needs to do and be aware of is to not be Santa Monica. Santa Monica is somebody who works there and does that commute back and forth every day, is a miserable place to get out of in the evening. Okay, getting into Santa Monica, just to let you know, my commute in the morning is usually 25, 30 minutes. If I time it just right, I can sometimes get to work in 20 minutes or less. That's not the truth going home. So if I time it right and I do Waze or Google or apps or various things like that, I can do it in 35. If I don't time it right, it's 45 or 50. And sometimes it's worse than that. And the truth is that also involves me being aware of where I can drive, what neighborhoods I can drive through, as those people who are very aware in Sunkist Park are, with all the signs up, don't drive through our neighborhood. The fact is that you get impacted by a lot of different things. And that's not even counting the fact that the airport is a major barrier to traffic going around it that affects Culver City. It affects Sepulveda Boulevard. But Culver City doesn't have the same issues as El Segundo, which is utterly an employment center and doesn't have nearly as many people living there, or Beverly Hills. But nobody wants to use Beverly Hills as a model. As bad as Culver City feels like, as bad as Santa Monica is, Beverly Hills is just insane. Think about it this way. In the 1950s, Beverly Hills successfully blocked the Santa Monica Freeway from going through Beverly Hills. It's why it does this turn and goes south, is because basically Beverly Hills said, no, we don't want that. We don't want the pollution. We don't want anything else. Culver City didn't exactly win that fight, but Beverly Hills did. The interesting thing is that now that you have the purple metro line being extended, what was interesting is, in spite a lot of the NIMBYs, particularly around the high school or particularly in various parts of Beverly Hills politicians and residents actively wanted the rail line to go through their city. Not only is it going through their city, the stop is by Rodeo Drive. Think about that. Okay, and for those of you, by the way, who are saying, oh my God, it's going to bring the riffraff, it's like, oh, hardly. And the fact is, what it does is it brings tourists and it brings a lot of other people who are fundamentally going to go through and be interested in it. And anybody who's spent time in London or Rome or Paris knows that there are mass transit stops right by the most shishi expensive shopping districts in the city, and it doesn't mean a thing. So
when you're young, it kind of sucks to not have any public transport like that anyway, because you can't drive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of the things is also that comes up, by the way, is, and you see this increasingly reflected in statistics with millennials and Generation Y, people are more and more reluctant to invest in cars. They do it, in a lot of cases, you have a strange circumstance where it's actually the middle class and the upper middle class who can better get away with not having a car, because they can afford to buy near a mass transit line or a bus line, rail line that also happens to go to where they're employed. If, in fact, it is the people in the lower working class who often have to get beater cars because they have to work from job to job to job all over the city. And as much as I'm very familiar with people at Metro, and I know a number of them, the Metro bus system, the mapping of the bus lines, has not been studied and realigned in over 25 years. So it does not match commute patterns anymore. Okay, so keep that in mind. And there are first mile, last mile issues I'll get into, and there are various other things, and they all affect us. They don't just affect people in other parts of the city. And on top of that, you have a major issue, which is that when Jerry Brown very nobly said illegal immigrants can have a driver's license, what it did is that it significantly increased the number of cars on the road and cut the number of bus riders. Because what happened is that people basically who had to spend their entire day on buses to get from job to job to job could suddenly get a beater car and drive around and felt like they had more control of their economic destiny. What that also meant, however, is that they were more dependent on those vehicles, and if something happened to them, then they were stuck. And so it's a real dilemma that's happening, and it's happening for a lot of people. Now, anyway, for Culver City, as we go about and talking about, is that there's another issue, which is sales taxes and various other costs of taxes, which is that Culver City, for those of you who are very familiar with it, is one of the most expensive places to buy something in the West Side. It's not unique. Santa Monica is also pretty awful. And part of that really comes down to the fact that there are a couple things going on. First, I will say this, and not to knock anybody on the current city council or anything like that, because the current city council inherited this problem. Culver City has a fiscal problem. For those of you who all voted for extending the sales tax, understood that there is a fiscal issue in the city, and people brought it up. It's a pension problem. For those of you who are not aware, basically Culver City and a number of different municipalities basically signed on to CalPERS, which is the State Municipal Employees Retirement Program. In the 1990s, CalPERS basically cut benefits, realized, we're going to run out of money. We're going to be, we need to cut things back. And then what happened was that the dot-com bubble happened. California suddenly had this massive spike in capital gains taxes and various other revenue sources. And the unions, the public employee unions, went to Governor Gray Davis at the time and said, this is unfair. Why were things getting cut when the city's awash with money? And he rescinded all the cuts. We're living with it now. Because Culver City, by signing on to CalPERS, is legally obliged to go with whatever happened at the state. And we're dealing with that retirement problem. And this is not to say that I'm trying to deny retirement benefits to anybody. It means that nobody planned on it. None of the cities, there are a huge number of cities in California, there are a number in the states, there are cities around this country who all are facing this. And our school district is facing this, and our city is facing this. And a lot of reasons, if you look at it, where revenues for the school district have gone up, but we have trouble retaining teachers in Culver City because rents have gone up, it's become less affordable, and our salaries haven't gone up proportionally because all the money's going to retirees, and particularly to retiree health benefits, and that's a whole other story. But it's something just to be mindful of when you're looking at sales taxes and revenues in the city, and realizing that one of the reasons that the city does red light cameras, even though it's largely a scam and most people have gotten rid of it, is that proportionately for Culver City, it's a good revenue source. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you look at it, Culver City, in terms of sales and use tax rates, is more expensive, which means people from a retail standpoint, people from a business standpoint, have to feel like they want to be here. And what's really important is to keep that balance where you get these revenues coming in, but you don't drive businesses and residents out. That people want to shop here, people want to spend here, and businesses want to be here. If you look at it, there's a very diverse tax base with a huge number of shifting revenues. There's issues in services, licenses, property taxes, and so on. Property taxes are interesting because we're in California with Proposition 13, which means that property taxes can only reset if the house is, or a property is sold, or if it's remodeled. And if it's remodeled, the property, the physical property, that value doesn't reset, the taxes don't reset, but the assessment on the improvements resets. And there's been some talk about split roll property taxes and various things like that. The concern with all of that is, and the concern with property taxes, is that two things have happened. It means that there's some limits to revenue, so the city has to find other ways to do it because property taxes are limited. And it also means that a lot more of the money that would have gone to the city now goes to the state, and then it's given back to the city, which means we have less control over it. But as you can see, revenues go up and down. They can be very cyclical, and this is not even counting a recession, by the way. There's no recession on this. When a recession happens, cities can be in a lot harder time. So you have a lot of shifts in the tax base, various things. There are different ways that the city is adapted in terms of its revenues. And at the same time, you see you've got this significant issue with home market values. And if you look at it and you say, as bad as you think that it is in Culver City, remember, Culver City is the orange, so it's not that horrible. So if you look at it, Culver City was right by the orange, which is Santa Monica, largely driven by the fact that, remember, Santa Monica is very heavily dominated by condos, not just houses. And what's happened is that Santa Monica has taken off because of the concentration of high-end employment. Culver City has taken off because of the increased employment. El Segundo actually has a higher prices, even though not as many people live there, because it's so close to jobs. And proximity to jobs in many ways has replaced most other factors in the cost of where you live. And as more jobs are created, if not enough housing supply is created to go with those jobs, you wind up with a problem. And not enough of the right kind of housing supply. And so that creates a lot of challenges. Beverly Hills has taken off because, quite honestly, there's a huge amount of money, particularly foreign money, that's come in and just jacked up the prices of these high-end trophy properties. If you ever wonder, by the way, a significant amount of the Middle Eastern royal families all have extra residences in Beverly Hills. I mean, I'm not kidding about that. They actually do, and quite often if you hang around Beverly Hills in the evening, you can see a certain number of the kids in very interesting outfits wandering around town. It's a lot of money. Average monthly rents. Interestingly enough, Culver City has actually not gotten nearly as horrible. It stayed relatively flat in many ways. It actually went down a little bit around 2016, 2017. It's not cheap. It's certainly not what it was when I first moved in. It's still not affordable, but the rents aren't as bad. What's really been driven up are the housing prices, and largely because of the fact that there just aren't enough family homes near Silicon Beach in the areas on the west side. And I'm not, by family homes, I mean not just regular big houses with a yard. I mean townhouses. I mean condos that are 3 or 4 bedrooms. I mean things that fundamentally are designed to handle kids and families. And what happens is that people will either pay a premium or you wind up having families that just move out. And that's always a risk in any circumstances. Auto delays. Los Angeles Metro has seen massive increases in delays. They're going up, creeping towards 120 hours a year. That's really kind of horrifying. And LA is basically catching up with a transit gap. So if you look at it, not only is LA among the worst in the country, if not the worst, you've got the fact that this map, this LA County Metro map, and you can see that there's a lot of these lines. Most of these lines didn't exist 20 years ago. But if you look at the pattern of these lines, you notice something. They all go towards downtown Los Angeles. Downtown Los Angeles was supplanted by the West Side as the main employment center in the 90s. But because of all the old rail lines and all the old plans were basically set up in the early 20th century and then in the 1950s and early 60s, they're all designed around a system that doesn't actually exist anymore, that you don't have this pattern. For those of you who've been to any of the open houses, Metro is finally trying to build a line going from the airport up along the 405 freeway to the valley. That could have a huge impact in Culver City, but it's a number of years away. Get interested in it. Pay attention to it. I know it feels ages away, but the Expo line felt like a dream for a really long time. And back when Zev Yaroslavsky was basically blocking it, when Henry Waxman was saying, it was actually passed a federal mandate blocking federal funds to a rail line in his own home district. Think about that. The congressman actually blocked money going to his home district for mass transit. It caused a lot of cascading backed up issues. And if you look at the Expo line route map now, what you see is the fact that it links Santa Monica, downtown. It's a wonderful idea. The problem is with the Expo line is that two things have happened for Culver City. The first is that you can't actually make the Expo line carry that many more passengers than it does right now. It's because of the stations, you can't do more than 3-car trains. You're limited by the fact that it runs at grade, meaning at street level a certain amount of times by how often you can run trains. And the other thing that happened, and it really affected Culver City boarding, is if you look at it, that it peaked in 2017 and it's gone down. What's the main reason that boardings in Culver City went down? It's not because of the local economy. It's not because patterns shifted, except for, to some extent, extending the line where Culver City was the terminus and no longer was, but that wasn't the issue in 2017. The reason was they tore out the parking lot. And what was the worst thing is that there was a parking lot put in. They redid the parking lot, because if you remember, the parking lot when the station first opened was cruddy. It was actually pretty horrible. They spent a bunch of money paving it, making it lovely, and then tore it out for the mixed-use development. And that development took so long in terms of getting started and the construction that even though it is supposed to actually have a significant amount of dedicated parking for the line, the use patterns for everybody changed. In fact, if you look at it, a certain amount of that Jefferson buildup that happened is people who basically realized it's easier to park at the La Cienega Jefferson station than it is to park by the Trader Joe's and walk or take the shuttle. And that really brings up another issue that you also see with bus routes, is that there are not a lot of bus routes that run in Culver City that fundamentally serve the first mile, last mile. Culver City is wonderful in that it has its own bus system, but if you look at the frequency of these bus routes and how they connect to the Expo line stations and others, they don't run very often, and they tend to be full, the ones that interconnect. And that's where it comes in with both Culver City buses. It's what comes in with LA and Metro. It's the fact that there aren't very good spaces for the buses to wait around these stations in most places. I can get into my rant about Art Leahy and not understanding first mile, last mile issues. He was the former head of Metro. But really what it comes down to is that the ultimate success in many ways for getting people out of their cars and into mass transit is first mile, last mile. People do not want to change modes of transit more than once, and they will tolerate it up to 2 times. At 3 times, they will simply drive. And so solving that for Culver City is going to be a huge advantage for our traffic. It's going to make a huge difference in terms of our planning. And figuring out how to do that and how to address those commute patterns and what comes out of the Metro study and how Culver City can align with that is going to make a big difference for us and for everybody going through the city. Now, the last thing is opportunity zones. Opportunity zones, none of them are actually in Culver City because, strangely enough, no part of Culver City was considered to be underprivileged, underdeveloped. But right around Culver City, there are multiple opportunity zones, particularly to the east. And you wind up with a situation where they're near the Hayden Tract. There's a number of developments around that area. There are a number of developments that, even if they're not opportunity zones, people are putting money in. For those of you who aren't aware, this sort of mixed-use tech entertainment location on Jefferson Boulevard that's north of Raintree on the other side of the road just sold for a significant amount of money because people are really interested in it. A lot of developments are going into the West Adams area, towards Crenshaw, towards Baldwin Hills, because you're still proximate, in many cases, to the mass transit, you're proximate to the freeway, you're proximate to where people live, And the values are there, especially if you have an opportunity zone, which basically gives a tax break for long-term investments in those areas. The idea is essentially that money is going in because it's geographically significant. And the reason it matters for us, even if it's not in Culver City, is it means more jobs are being added on the east edge of the city. More development's going to be happening. For those of you who remember where the radio station was right at La Cienega and Jefferson, it's poof, and there's now a big tall building going up and a big hole in the ground right next to it. That's happening because people want to be near the mass transit stations, because people want to develop and be in accessible locations. And that's happening, and it's affecting us. And it's worth keeping that in mind, is that a lot of the various patterns that happen, like when Jefferson Boulevard goes down to one lane for a stretch because they're redoing the water mains east of us for a while, when Culver Boulevard has a major realignment because of infrastructure issues that are going on, once again, mostly water and other related issues. It affects us. And Culver City's infrastructure, as much as we like thinking of Culver City as a fairly new modern city, a lot of it was set up in the early 1900s. Some of the pipes and water infrastructure that was here goes back to the 1800s when it was farmland. And that kind of ongoing transformation is going to continue to happen. And it's going to affect us. And as Culver City in particular winds up in a situation where development happens around it, it's going to have to adapt. And it means that, as much as people might be driven crazy by mixed-use developments around the Expo Line station, if they were going to happen, that's in an area that actually fundamentally makes sense. The issue is not the development itself, it's how you adapt to the development. And whether or not the development also, when you add jobs and you add offices, you also figure out a strategy for adding condos, places that are, that fit the people who are coming in to live and work. And can you add that in a way in locations in the city and around the city that fundamentally add into, they're additive, that basically make it a better city to live in. One of the things that I'll throw out, which is something always for people to talk about and consider, is that I know that when my kids have gone through elementary school, and they've gone through, a few years ago I talked to the different teachers and informally asked at different times how long it took them to drive to school. And I was talking to teachers who who were incentivized to leave right when the school ended because their commute was an hour and a half each way. Think about that. And you wonder why the teachers get cranky? One of the solutions that was actually put forth in the city of San Jose, that they've got the money for and they're doing, is that they said, we are going to allow new developments, but we are either going to invest in some of these developments and outright buy the properties, or we are going to provision them specifically so that a certain amount of affordable housing units are created and set aside for teachers. Because they were worried about losing teachers. They were worried about losing people, talented people. And I've heard people talk about either teachers, about municipal employees, about various others. Ultimately, that is a major issue. Any of you who've ever been to Venice, Italy, the core old part of Venice was built for 200,000 people. Only 50,000 live there. The reason is because not only have rich people gone in and bought up all the big old mansions, everything like that, or they've been turned into Airbnbs or hotels or anything, but the people who work in Venice can't afford to live there. They all live on the mainland. So the official city of Venice has a few 100,000 people, but all the residences are on the mainland in a place called Mestre. Key West, Florida has to bus workers in from Miami because the workers can't afford to live there. San Francisco, we already know about San Francisco and all the commute problems, everything's there. So for Culver City, strategically planning and thinking, when we talk about planning things out for the next few decades, figuring out how the people who work here, the people who work for the city, remember the city is one of the larger employers, especially if you include the schools, the people who work in waste management, people who work in these various other employers, how do they survive here? How do they live here? How do we do it so that You can create it so that people can live and have a 20-minute commute instead of an hour or 2-hour commute? How do you set it up so that people can do mass transit and want to do mass transit because they realize that it's a worthwhile thing to do and it works for them? And that means that we have to do a serious thinking about what the city feels like and works and functions in the larger overall economy, and to make those decisions. And it's something that everybody should be aware of. It's something that you should think about. It's something that you should look up at and realize, because these discussions are going on all the time. And they affect you. And they affect your kids, and they affect your friends and everybody else. And understanding how the regional economy works and how it affects your day-to-day life is very important. And we're about to deal with the coronavirus and some of those impacts. There's a very good chance that the virus, combined with its impact in manufacturing in China, combined with what it may be doing here, may cause a recession. And what happens in a recession is that people suddenly think, wow, there are fewer cars on the road. Things are easier and more manageable. Well, yeah, a certain number of our friends don't have a lot of work, but it's easier to get around. And it only lasts a little while, because one of the reasons Santa Monica has the problems it has is that they approved all those developments when LA was in its worst recession that it had in the 90s. And people forget, everybody talks about the Great Recession, but the recession in LA was massively horrible and lasted a number of years. And Santa Monica took years to catch up and adapt, because they didn't really connect the planning with the actual ultimate demand. Culver City is figuring that out now. And now is the time for people to check, to talk about it, to engage, and to realize that this is your chance to essentially affect the place you live for a number of years. So, thank you.
Do you take some questions?
All right, we'll absolutely take some questions. If I haven't driven people away at this point. So. All right. Remember, they are actually recording it. They're not going to hear you unless you're up at the microphone.
Excellent.
Yeah, that too.
Hi. Okay, I'm a Culver City gal. I've watched it evolve. I've been part of Venice downtown. I was part of the first busing kids, intergenerational, intercultural issue. What about tiny homes? What about temporary use so that we can create massive communities of affordable, sustainable housing that isn't some trailer that molds, some HUD nightmare, all the way from people in transition because they've come to the city to work, to the people that really can't afford to even live anywhere near it.
Mm-hmm.
And so tiny homes and making sort of land allowances to be able to provide, there's plenty of land. The question is there a will, finally, for us to change some of these zoning situations so we can create some sustainable solutions?
The answer is yes. Tiny homes are something that absolutely should be considered. They're one of the things to keep in mind about tiny homes, for those of you who've sometimes seen the housing prices for ultra small units in San Francisco and others, is that what starts out as affordable, if you don't watch it, doesn't necessarily stay affordable. The main thing about it with anything like that, when you're increasing density, is plan it out well. I am somebody who's very much in favor of the idea that you should increase density, not only in Culver City, but in all of LA. I think that you necessarily have to realize that the dream of having your backyard, a big backyard, is hard. Culver City, interestingly enough, already started out with a number of smaller units. The lot size in Culver City is smaller than most of the surrounding areas. For those of you who have standalone homes, if you look at some of the development areas, some of the parts of Culver City that were built at different times in different phases, there are small homes, relatively speaking. There are multi-unit homes with with shared walls, things like that were done in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Bungalow housing.
Exactly, bungalow housing, townhouses, various other developments that have been done. It's happened. There are a lot of different ways to do it. And you're right, some of the developments have to be entry level for people who have no families. They have, they're generally on their own. Maybe you can, sustainable for a couple. And you have to do some of that. But you also have to do affordable family housing, and you have to balance it out, because you want people to be able to stay here and you want to be able to adapt to everybody. Homelessness exists largely in California because California fundamentally discouraged housing development for 30 years. There is a huge, huge imbalance between supply and demand. And when California finally did encourage development, it was all greenfield sites in the middle of nowhere. So people were building mansions in Lancaster, they were building mansions in San Bernardino, and then everybody had an hour-and-a-half commute each way. And what actually killed all of that development was that gas prices right before the recession spiked. People forget that you're suddenly up to $6 a gallon sometimes for gas, and nobody wanted to pay that. And so all of that collapsed, and nobody's really been building houses since then because they were building the wrong houses in the wrong places, and they've never really adjusted. And we haven't made it easier. We haven't permitted, we haven't facilitated. And the truth is that you actually have to have municipal government be willing to take chances to create exemptions to the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, or certainty in the system in order to make it happen. It actually takes a fair amount of planning and work.
Hi, thank you. I have a fun little question, and then I have a more serious question. The first one is, I wonder what Century City's relationship is to Culver City, because that's where I live. And my second question is that all these things that you're talking about right now, as a millennial, I feel left behind because you mentioned Beverly Hills. I went to Beverly Hills High School, and they never talk about these subjects like transit and city relationships and employment. And even when you get to university, these subjects aren't brought up. So as a millennial, I feel that I didn't have this kind of education of like city planning and what it all means. And when I graduated, it was like a smack across my face because you have to figure all this stuff on your own. So, okay, so those two questions. What was those relationships, and what can we do about this to teach young people all of these dynamics so they're not confused?
Well, the two things are, the first one, Motor Avenue, basically, is the easy one because, basically goes from studio to studio. And there is a commute relationship. The other is that each city basically had a significant amount of development come out of the fact that that their local studios had major financial problems. So when 20th Century Fox did the movie Cleopatra, it basically ran out of cash, and it sold off a huge chunk of the back lot for development in what became Modern Century City. And in Culver City, basically Studio Estates, Raintree, all that basically was selling off the MGM back lot, and that's it. The other is that I'll say this, is that it's not unique to millennials. Infrastructure and city planning and all that, I made this line years ago, it still holds true, and I've said this, by the way, in a lot of different audiences. I've said this to state officials and federal officials and various others. Infrastructure is not sexy. It is something that's expensive, it's something that is a lasting cost. There are only 3 occasions where people really care about infrastructure and planning. The first is when something new is getting built. When a city is getting built or something's happening. When Henry Huntington was basically had the red car line, which was used to spur real estate development. They were tied together. That's why the red cars, all that existed, was to basically encourage people to go live where he was developing new places like Huntington Park and Huntington Beach and Huntington Gardens, all these different things that basically exist out. Huntington Gardens, by the way, was his house, and it had its own private red car line. But the second is when somebody makes it their signature issue. So Dwight Eisenhower and the interstate highways, for example. When somebody decides they want a big dam built and that's their legacy, that kind of thing, that's when it happens. And the third is when there's a crisis. But people don't teach it. It's not something that people really talk about and learn. And this is where it really comes down to. When it's a crisis is when cities and neighborhoods get mobilized, when they realize there's a problem. Geography, urban planning, certain kinds of economics like that, public policy, most people don't learn that. And there's no mandate to learn it. And even if you get into the college, there's, like the Cal State system has a mandated California civics class. That's the closest you get. But other than that, no. It's something you actually have to seek out. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say your tie is awesome.
Thank you.
I was like, wait, which one do I take? All right.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately for everybody, there isn't a good LA tie. This is New York.
But they've done a good job. I lived there for 7 years, and I love not having a car there. It was so I experienced so much because of the infrastructure. That's very well, and it's still working today. Okay, so question is, there are these companies coming in, these tech companies. Is there an effective strategy that we can do now to somehow affect the tax code or create some sort of way right here in Culver City, taking this because they need this space. Like it's not, they won't run away. You know, like they're definitely going to need this space. So is there a way to kind of, as a community, like be like, hey, listen, a big chunk, you're going to pay a little bit extra to help us with all the other stuff we need to do here.
Well, here's what it comes down to. The most important thing to understand about taxes, and we always have to be careful about tax increases, is that nobody likes a tax increase where they don't know where the money is going. All right, this is very significant, and it's one of the things it comes down to is that HBO can go back to Santa Monica. They don't need to be here. You know, Apple, you know, Apple and Amazon are tied into Culver Studios and various things like that, but they don't still need to be here. They can move out a little bit. There are ways to adjust it. The main thing you have to be mindful of is that you want to work with new employers on that first and last mile infrastructure issue, because the real problem they create is not existing, it's not being here, it's the burden on municipal services and on the infrastructure. So, you know, when you had San Francisco actually work, ironically somewhat derided, with Google on buses, and you've had various companies in Silicon Valley who've actually collaborated on transit solutions, it's worked really well, and they will subsidize them. Going, instead of just simply levying a tax, but actually originally trying to create a voluntary effort to address that first and last mile issue, to work on shuttle services, to work on buses, to get people to and from places where they live into the jobs, or at least from the train stations, and even if they're by the train station, potentially, to realize not everybody lives that way. They might live north or south and they can't use the rail line. But looking at ways to address that is a way where they pay for it or heavily subsidize it. Then suddenly they're taking their fair share. They're doing something to alleviate this, and it makes them look good rather than burdened. Now, negotiations may fail. You may wind up saying, oh my God, these people don't have a clue, and you wind up taxing them anyway. But the problem is the precedent. The problem that happens is separating between the new arrivals and the existing companies, and how do you create a strategy to deal with that? And Culver City is already one of the most expensive places for a business to operate in the area. And so you have to look at it from that lens and say, well, they need to come here. But yeah, they can move in a couple years. You know, you get the tax benefit for a little bit, and then you lose it again. So you have to think about, how do you strategize that? How do you do it? Look at what some of the Silicon Valley communities have done. How do you balance it out? There are examples. There are plenty of examples on it. But ultimately, can you leverage that? Can you work with them to actually do the kind of improvements that Culver City already needs? Do you get them involved with the planning process and affect that? Because otherwise, yeah, every job is mobile. As much as Culver City is desirable, to be blunt, it's desirable because of the nice mixture of location and people and services. But if that balance shifts, if services become too burdensome and they're not good, you know, people pay a lot of money but they don't get anything in return, yeah, they'll move. People do that on a regular basis. If these businesses were coming in because of tax breaks, it's always better to look at the tax breaks first and say, can we eliminate these tax breaks, or can we modify the tax breaks, rather than creating a structural tax increase, because people sue, people fight, it gets the community angry, things like that. It's try and figure out a proactive solution that actually looks towards what's going towards the future. It's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy for Culver City, but it's something to actually look at and figure out what's the balance there and how can you do it.
Hi. I have two questions related to the slides.
Yeah.
One is just like a gap in knowledge. I don't know what an opportunity is.
Oh, sure. I can happily talk about that. And what's the other one?
Well, I want you to go back to the slide on average housing prices.
Sure.
Really
Home market value.
Super data nerd question. As I was looking at this slide, I could not help but wonder what the median is for each of these, and if there is a significant differential between the average and the median. Like I imagine, I imagine in Beverly Hills there is a difference. between the average and the median, but I'm curious here if we're seeing like a certain set of new developments or something like drive up that average.
Well, the answer, and it's a good question. Really what it comes down to, and I don't have that, and you're right, probably should, and I can always look it up later, but part of it's also the way the data is set up. But first, an opportunity zone is basically, I won't go into all of it. What it was is that there was a bill introduced a few years ago by Cory Booker, who's a Democrat from New Jersey, and Tim Scott, who is a Republican from South Carolina, to create, based on working with what's a group thing called the Economic Innovations Group, EIG, which was actually funded by Sean Parker, of all people, who, Mr. Napster, Facebook, so on. And what happened was that he had actually wanted to put money into trying to push sort of common good things in Washington. And they came up with this proposal, and Scott and Booker were really interested in it. It didn't manage to make it through the Senate the first time. And so it got attached to the 2017 tax bill. So in the 2017 tax bill, it was put in, and the idea behind it was supposed to be job creation in economically disadvantaged areas. And one of the reasons it was tied to the tax bill is because you had a lot of capital being repatriated. You had a lot of basically capital gains that were going to go on where taxes were being lowered essentially for corporations and for the rich. And the idea was to get them to reinvest that money in disadvantaged areas. But there are two things that happened out of it that were an issue. The first is something that I blatantly actually told to the EIG people when it was going through, which is, it's set up for 10 years in patient capital and long-term investments. And if you look at the way that the regulations are, there's one class of investment that will maybe way easier for everybody to do. That's real estate. And that's what's happened in most of the news, and like the New York Times hates it because they've seen a lot of the real estate investment. All the high-profile investments, by the way, are not real estate ones. They're actually meant to be job creation ones. Now, sometimes you had things like, Amazon and HQ2 in New York, where the Long Island City location they were looking into was actually in an opportunity zone. And there are some questions about that. Really, though, what it comes down to is what they're meant to do is be long-term investments, not by banks, but by various investment funds into creating jobs in the local area. And the idea is that because you essentially get a tax holiday if you keep your money in it for the entire period, that you have a reason to stay invested and not just pull your money out again. And in theory, it's actually a really nice setup. In practice, it's hard to execute, and basically the Treasury Department had to go through a series of guidelines that had to be issued and had to clarify this before a lot of this investment was happening. But there are some opportunity zone developments that are really taking off. And if you ask, most of them are in locations that are geographically desirable.
Yeah.
These happen to fit that.
It's a quick question. What metrics are they using to determine what is an underserved community?
Okay, so the way it worked is that essentially each state got to determine it. It wasn't the federal government at all. So what happened was that each state wound up doing it. So I actually had a whole series of discussions with the Brown administration because I knew the people who were actually designating them. I had nothing to do with what was designated. I just was talking with them about some of the classifications. And it was supposed to be a certain amount of income relative to poverty, a certain amount of reduced economic activities compared to the surrounding areas. In some of the states, by the way, absolutely tried to nominate opportunity zones that didn't fit the criteria, and they got rejected by the federal government because the federal government couldn't choose any positively. They could just reject ones that didn't fit the criteria. So you had some opportunity zones around the country that really weren't impoverished or disadvantaged. So basically the state would then go ahead and select them. The federal government would check them based on data. They'd go through them with census data and various other employment data to say, okay, is it disadvantaged enough? And by the way, remember, this is relative to the surrounding area. So a number of cases you could have an area like these where it's right by Culver City and you'd think it's not that badly off, but it is relatively speaking compared to Culver City, Century City, Ladera Heights, etc. And that's the kind of important distinction to make. In terms of the issues, in terms of average and median homes, a lot of it really has to do with the kind of housing that exists in the area. Culver City hasn't had a tremendous change in its housing stock to really change these numbers and to adjust the average and median because there just haven't been enough new developments added where the units have been added. If you look, Santa Monica, one of the reasons that Santa Monica did not accelerate and take off nearly the way it did is just because a disproportionately huge amount of Santa Monica's population is all apartments and condos, as opposed to larger homes. People tend to think about the really big houses in the north end of the city. They might think about the houses that are down near the airport in Sunset Park, or the houses, or the houses and condos on the beach. But it's remembering most of Santa Monica isn't that. And Santa Monica has 90,000 people. Culver City has 40,000 people. So that has a much bigger effect on it. So when you see Culver City's numbers going up, assume that the average and the median are actually much more closely tied together than they would be in, say, a Santa Monica.
Okay, last comment, and then I'm going to go home. If we had more time, I would love to talk about how opportunity zones likely drive gentrification and lead to different outcomes than expected.
Well, here's the thing about it. Every single strategy for incentivized economic development runs the risk of gentrification. That is always, always, always an issue. And I say this knowing people who have lived in places, like I had a cousin who basically lived in the Mission in San Francisco in a lovely old 1920s apartment building that basically she was forced out to Oakland because that area gentrified with people working at Google and Facebook. You know, she can't afford it. She couldn't even afford a third of the rent now. Okay, and that's sort of it. That's lower middle class as opposed to down working class. I mean, I've had these discussions with some of the county supervisors about incentivizing life sciences and biotech and whether or not you want it in the neighborhood because it might gentrify too quickly. Gentrification really becomes a problem when you don't build enough housing to go with the new jobs. If you don't adjust accordingly, which means that the property values skyrocket for residential properties because people pay through the nose because the average wage being created is out of whack with the local rental and housing costs. It's that disproportion. If you do mixed use, you try to create a strategy where you try to look into affordable housing, you try to do things like that, gentrification is not an issue. I mean, if you look at the cycles of gentrification, boom and bust, that happened in Inglewood, if you look at some of the things that have happened in different parts of the city where people have been forced out, it's astonishing. And one of the funny things that I remember, just sort of the inverse side of it in gentrification. In the 1980s, Culver City tried to annex Ladera Heights. They went to the Ladera Heights people and said, "We would like you to join Culver City." And the Ladera Heights people looked at Culver City and said, "Hell no." And if you looked at it at the time, it was the reverse gentrification issue. The average income, the average home price, the average everything in Ladera Heights was vastly ahead of Culver City. But Culver City has gentrified significantly because, as I said, MGM got replaced by Sony. You've had a number of new businesses going on. And Culver City's housing prices and the jobs that are here and everything have adjusted significantly. And the problem that it comes down to with gentrification is that it's not just your city, it's the surrounding area and this ripple effect. And if you really wanted to make a great house investment, one of the best places to have bought a house was in West Adams before the Expo line came through. Once the Expo line came through, in many cases, the average houses that were like in 5-minute walk of the station, their value went up $200,000. I mean, within like 6 months. It was astonishing. Or it wasn't, because it was actually fairly predictable. But the fact is that kind of pattern happens. The thing is when you have an opportunity zone, is if you're creating jobs, you better create housing. If you're creating jobs and housing, you better create transportation. And you better plan that out, because otherwise you either wind up with a traffic bottleneck, or you wind up with housing prices horribly out of whack, or you wind up with jobs that aren't really serving the local community. And all of that is a balancing act that you have. And that's not just opportunity zones. I mean, I've advised, of all things, the city of Pittsburgh on a major industrial redevelopment where they're going to take an old steel plant that they've been trying to figure out what to do with for years and years and years, and there are different kind of uses for that. And their balancing act is, how do they create not only higher-end jobs, but middle-class, entry-level middle-class jobs that affect the surrounding area. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge for everybody. But you have to be mindful that gentrification is a problem. Anybody who lives in Washington, D.C. may be aware of, or has lived there, is aware of that. But it happened in D.C. because of the fact that there's a huge amount of money that basically flowed into Washington in the mid-2000s, and nobody built enough housing or enough, and the mass transit system, as much as there was one, wasn't aligned to where connecting the jobs and the housing. They're trying to catch up now. Look at all the new developments in Northern Virginia. A lot of that is driven by this effort to catch up, but it's forced lots of people out of their old historic neighborhoods. And it happens cyclically, and it's happened cyclically throughout the U.S. for 100 years or more. We just have to be smart and anticipate what the effects are of the development and plan accordingly.
Thank you.
Certainly. Anybody else? Sure.
Where did all that money come from in D.C. in the 2000s period?
War on terror. Essentially what happened is that you had after 9/11, you had a massive jump, and two things happened. One was the government spent a huge amount of money increasing the military, sending the military overseas. You had, the Iraq War, Afghanistan. But the other thing was that really happened is that traditionally, in most wars the U.S. has fought, there's a ramping up. Basically, most of that money spent is tied directly to the government. Some of it will go to defense contractors, various others. What happened in the 2000s is that we outsourced a ridiculous amount of it. So a huge amount of money went to contractors that was previously taken care of by military logistics and various parts of the government. And so tons of people got very wealthy, basically getting their piece of the pie. And the population of the Washington Metro exploded. The amount of money that was going there exploded. Northrop Grumman, one of the major reasons they moved their headquarters from being in LA, they were in Century City, and they moved to Northern Virginia, was because they wanted to be closer to the source of the money. Lockheed Martin basically moved to Maryland during the Lockheed Martin-Marietta merger, even though Lockheed was the larger company, because they wanted to be closer to the source of the money. And there are a number of other companies that have done the same. You've seen construction companies that have done that, various others. And it had a very profound effect on Washington. And in many ways, Washington's transformation hasn't changed. And even though that government money has eased off, especially since we're not, heavily involved in ground activity in all these places and lots of troops overseas and not ostensibly rebuilding countries, what's happened instead is that a lot of that has now shifted to electronics companies and various others, where they basically hired a lot of the people who are already there. And so Maryland and Virginia have done really well in sort of creating these private sector jobs that serve a whole bunch of other purposes. But that's why.
So this is a little out there, but is there any way that policy or regulation could actually control who buys some of these properties that then jack the prices up? Because I know in Baja, I think Americans can't go down there and buy something. You can lease it for a long time, but you can't actually purchase it.
Well, there are two ways I can do that. First, I can say that, when Culver City was founded, a lot of properties actually had these riders on them that wouldn't let certain people buy them. But that was actually true around a lot of California. Those riders are illegal, fortunately for all of us. But if you ever look at your deed for your property, you will sometimes find that if you looked at the original deed, you wouldn't be able to sell to some of your friends, let alone yourself. That being said, the bigger issue that really is a problem isn't simply foreign investors, it's real estate trusts. A huge amount of housing stock has basically been taken out of circulation throughout the United States in major cities by real estate trusts going in and buying private properties and turning them into rental properties. Or remodeling them, jacking them up, and doing it. There's actually, in my neighborhood, there's more than one house that has basically been remodeled in the exact same floor plan. It drives me bananas because it's a flawed floor plan. The property value, the cost of the house has been doubled. They've been redone, and they've been done basically by these investment trusts. And they're flipping the houses and driving up. They took what was a relatively affordable house and made it a high-end house. And they're going to get their money because there's not enough housing stock. So you can look, and quite honestly, I think it's both at a city and state level, at some provisions on the real estate trusts and what they can buy, because that's a corporate issue. That is not an issue of profiling individuals. That's not an issue of foreigners or various things like that. I mean, anybody you know who lives in like San Marino or Alhambra or some areas like that, you have a whole bunch of absentee Chinese landlords who basically bought up the properties, stuck their kids or their grandkids or their parents or somebody living there to hold the property, and essentially used it to get money out of China. I mean, there are a number of cases like that happened for a number of years and still are happening in some places. But that's not really Culver City's issue. The real issue is it's the real estate investment vehicles that buy up properties and drive up the values that have nothing really to do with reality. There's also a whole bunch of issues about that we're operating in a really low interest environment. You know, the Fed just cut interest rates by 0.5 point again. Ultimately, though, while we're still operating with restrictions on getting a mortgage, you know, your average down payment has to be 20% versus 10%. You know, it's actually a lot harder. So when you look at who can get the money, and the answer is it's largely corporations and investment trusts, and that's creating a whole other set of issues. But that's where you have to look. And if you're going to look at it from a regulatory standpoint, that's the thing to look at.
Okay. And one other thing. So Culver City has jurisdiction down Washington Boulevard, I think all the way just about to Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Just a strip on either side of Washington, and then the rest like Mar Vista or parts of LA. So it's really interesting. I have friends that live over that way. They're building these pretty massive apartments. I don't know if some of them are condos, but there's a huge one now, Inglewood and Washington.
And is it the City View one, or is it? I think I know one you're talking about. Yeah. What? Haven. Yeah.
And it's just massive, and it kind of looms, and you know,
well,
is there a way that they have to somehow try and accommodate or have input from the neighbors?
There are. There are a number of different ways you can do it. One of the fun ways is, ironically, to reverse around and look at CEQA again. But but mostly what it comes down to is that they're mandated traffic studies that you have to do. When developments happen in Culver City right on the LA border, technically speaking, LA residents and the city of LA can intervene. The inverse is also true if it happens in Culver City. You know, if you're worried about it, you know, or you know people who are worried about it, a lot of times it's basically go to the city councils. Go to the Culver City Council and raises an issue. Go to Mike Bonin's office, because Mike Bonin is basically city councilman for most of the West Side, and find out who you can raise the issue with, because there are impact studies that have to be done. There are various due diligence that has to be done, and you can't. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of times what happens is that, you know, a lot of it comes down to zoning that basically was already there that nobody ever took advantage of. And so you're ultimately dealing with the fact that it still hits the height restriction rules, it hits various other things. There are also some state changes that were done where if you have a certain amount of affordable housing, you can make a higher building. That gets there's some examples even in Culver City where people are proposing developments like the one at 11111 Jefferson, where if you look at it from a traffic feasibility standpoint, it will never ever get built, because that's actually one of the busiest locations in Culver City for traffic. But if you look at it from the height rules and the affordability rules and all that, they're very good at figuring out what's within the law, and so you have to look at it from an impact standpoint and say, hey, is this a question? And quite honestly, that development, given the fact that it's a traffic island between two major streets coming together, is a significant problem, because I don't know if any of you ever used to drive down Sepulveda before they basically synchronized the lights a number of years ago. It's like 7-8 years ago. It used to back up all the way over the Bologna Creek Bridge, and it would just back up for sometimes a mile or two in its worst. And that's a risk again. And once again, as I said, it's the traffic impact, it's mitigating it. How do you do that? And so that's the kind of thing you have to look at in any of those developments. And in the case of the Washington Boulevard one, is that a case where people have looked at the impacts and looked at the overall elements? And yeah, it may stink. I mean, I had a cousin of mine who basically had a big high-rise built right behind her place, but there was not much he could do because it was already zoned for that and had been for years. Nobody had taken advantage of it. And so you just look at it. And don't be afraid to ask city councils or city clerks and find out.
A lot of the neighborhood doesn't really know about it until it's already happened.
Well, that's part of all right. Anyway, I have to be mindful. We're starting to get close to 8, so any last couple questions, and then we can.
We're obviously going to have to invite you over for a barbecue soon. So can affordable housing actually be built affordably? I mean, we don't have tons of money in the city, so we're going to have to make a partnership with the developer. Can they get enough of a return that's not exorbitant to actually build affordable? And should it be mixed use, but with 2, 3, 4 bedrooms?
Well, the answer is that it can be, but really it comes down to its regulatory. Most of the costs that go into housing now, and if you look at, when people were building units for homeless, and they were saying that, a single unit for somebody to house a homeless was going to cost, sometimes up to $500,000. That's insane. Okay, that's just beyond insane. Okay. And a lot of it, in terms of the cost, some of it is prevailing wage issues that the unions have insisted on and gotten through city councils and others. And prevailing wage is in theory a wonderful thing. In practice can cause real problems in terms of how it's defined, especially when you're trying to build affordable housing. Ironically enough, this also affects union members. This is a whole other issue. But a bigger issue comes down to, I've raised the issue of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, and some of the other regulations and planning. As much as people hate it when like a new property just suddenly pops up out of nowhere, the bigger concern for a lot of developers and a lot of others, by the way, that the Haven, I'm willing to bet, took multiple years to try and get through. It took a long time to navigate that process. And yeah, exactly. It takes a long time. So what you need to do is you need to be willing to essentially fight NIMBYism, especially your own, the not in my backyard mentality, and say, you know what, I'm willing to put up with this, especially if it's done right. You have to look at it and say, am I willing to put up with this? And essentially, right now, there's in some cases, to get around the Environmental Quality Act and get waivers, you have to go all the way to the governor just simply to get it done. And the governor's office isn't going to be able to do waivers for everybody in every city, every development. So the question is, are there ways to get around it? Some cases, cities can do collaborative efforts, easements. They can come up with a compromise in terms of building a larger than normal amount of affordable housing into a unit, not 5%, 10%, but like 20 or 30% in order to get a property through. And yeah, it can still, if the margins are good enough on a property and people do an assessment, they'll say, yeah, it's worth it. But a bigger amount of it is the uncertainty in the development and actively trying to get ahead of that. Because with CEQA, you can basically get a lawsuit filed by, quite often, a competitor or somebody else at any time during the process. And so there was a housing bill that was introduced last year called SB 50 that died. It got held up last year and died this year because the view was that it gave too much power to the state, enough to the local communities. Right now, the legislature is working on new provisions to allow the local communities a lot more control, which ultimately is what you need, because the local cities need to have the ability to do this and build things that fit the community, but they need to do it. There are still provisions, by the way, that exist in state law that say if you don't match your housing mandates, so like Redondo Beach, for example, it got sued by the state for trying to go around their mandates. But the key thing is you have to do it, but you need to have the local communities enabled so they can do public-private partnerships, so that they can do things where basically the city mitigates costs dramatically by coming up with a deal to reduce the regulatory burden, to reduce the overall cost of building these units and making it affordable to build a unit that has this. Because otherwise, the main housing units that get built, it's like if you go around downtown and you see all these sort of fake Italian condos, that was basically one developer who essentially figured out the economics of it and how to get it through and build a whole bunch of these really similar properties, all high-end aimed, because that's what they could get through, and that's what the price point was, and they figured out how to do it. And you don't want a whole bunch of those. You want to have something that better suits the community. And so right now, I say this because, and I will admit I'm somewhat biased because my colleagues at the think tank we're at are actually tied into some of these discussions. This is a big issue for us. This has been a big issue for a number of years. But you need the state legislature to basically create a way for communities to do a conscious development decision, particularly around housing. and they don't have enough power right now. And it takes a San Jose to basically say we can drop this deal and we can make it happen, because San Jose is a heck of a lot larger with a heck of a lot more money. But ultimately, it's something that needs to happen. And the question is, will it unfold that way over the next couple of years?
Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks for your presentation. Really appreciate it. You touched on some of the problems that are starting to become obvious in the city with infrastructure, things that haven't been updated in perhaps 80, 100 years. You also touched upon some of the financial realities of our city, and that our budget is under tremendous pressure because of CalPERS and catching up with pensions. So my question is, and our sales tax is already the highest that the state will allow. Our city council is getting ready to put a measure on the November ballot to increase business taxes as well. So given the realities of all of that, how can we fund infrastructure improvements and updates to keep our city somewhat current and ahead of what's needed?
Well, and that's where it comes into coming up with alternate strategies, because the one problem with going just simply around a tax route, and I'm not saying, look, I don't know exactly how the tax measure is and the way it's set up, but I think that you have to look at it, and this is what becomes significant, is how is the money going to be spent? If you create, the state, by the way, is notorious for having a set amount of money that's supposed to go to infrastructure and highway and roads and rating it on a regular basis. They take the money out of it and then say they'll promise to pay it back later. And what essentially what found out is the reason that like Measure M and Measure R and M and the sales tax passed in the county was because the money was specifically dedicated to go to mass transit infrastructure. You're right. Right now, ultimately, the only way to do it is to come up with either partnering with the private sector for the money to try and figure out how do you do that with a public-private partnership to invest in the infrastructure in a way that basically allows you to either pay it back over time or to get financing to structure it in an alternate way. There technically there is a state infrastructure bank called the iBank. Almost nobody uses it for what it's intended for because it doesn't really, even the capital that's there isn't really being used for that. There are a number of different provisions that go in that should be there. But one of the real problems is that there used to be a measure specifically to do that. It's called redevelopment. And so the question is right now for Culver City and for all those cities is there an alternate thing that needs to come through Sacramento that gives Culver City the power to do that? And once again, that's something that's pending. There's a number of discussions about it, but it is a problem. And the fact is that issue is, the business tax, as I said, it may be necessary, but the question is where does the money go? And if the businesses don't feel like it's going to infrastructure improvements, what will they do? And that's the kind of thing you have to do, because there is a limit. Ultimately, the main way for Culver City to easily get revenues is essentially for the housing prices to go up and for commercial real estate to go up and get turned over and be able to get those property taxes, because that money automatically stays locally. And business taxes help, but there is a set limit, and it's in many ways you get more by creating the jobs if you already have the business taxes and you get those monies, and it's a balancing act. It's not a simple answer.
One other quick question. Do you think there's any chance of some form of redevelopment coming back, state redevelopment?
Well, the good news is that Jerry Brown is no longer governor, so it's Gavin Newsom is certainly willing to consider it. I know there are discussions about it. I know it's going to take a little while, because the truth is that Governor Brown was able to get rid of redevelopment because there were a number of places where it was an incredibly flawed system. The problem was that by getting rid of all of it and then getting rid of the legal framework behind it, there's an issue. So, Culver City, by the way, has a redevelopment successor agency. It's already there. So the question is that can something be done from a legislative standpoint to take advantage of that existing entity and various things like that to empower it? And those discussions are ongoing, but it's going to take a little while. I think, though, that we're at the point for a lot of cities where there's a demand for that, and the legislature has changed enough, and you have a different governor, that it's now something that will be considered. But it's something to watch. But it's going to take a little while. It's not happening right now, but a lot of the discussions that might make that possible are starting this legislative session. I'm not going to make any predictions yet because I'm very aware of how the state legislature can work.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Just for anybody who's interested in knowing about how opportunity zones are determined and disadvantaged communities, there's something online you can look at called Cal EnviroScreen, which is, I think they've got a 37 data points for disadvantaged community definition that all lay on top of each other, and where it turns red is where the disadvantaged communities are in the state of California. So if you want to look that up, Cal EnviroScreen. But I have a question for you. You mentioned that Culver City is the most expensive place for a business to be. And I'm curious about that, since Culver City's business tax license is one of the lowest in the region, in our area. And so can you help please qualify?
Well, I didn't say that, by the way. Somebody else did. What I said is that Culver City is an expensive place in terms of taxes, in terms of some of it. Okay. Our business tax has room to go up, as I said, which is why you can do that. And it's not, ironically enough, a number of years ago, Culver City actually had a higher business tax. It dropped down, so there's room for it to go up again, which is why you can actually have it. I'm just saying is that it's one of those things to consider in terms of what that balance is. Culver City is a relatively expensive place to be in terms of sales and use taxes. It's relatively expensive in certain kinds of tax structures. A lot was done to try and encourage people to move here. Santa Monica is the expensive place, really, by the way, to be. And I would note that is that, and what I would say is that you're right, and it's worth clarifying one way or the other because it came up in the discussion, is that Culver City is an expensive place relative to some of the surrounding areas. If you compare Culver City to El Segundo, if you compare Culver City to even to Los Angeles used to be horrible, and they did a whole reform on business and use taxes in LA that actually brought the cost down. The main advantage to Culver City ultimately, though, isn't even simply cost. It's basically, can the bureaucracy handle it? And, is permitting fast? Is everything streamlined and easy? In Santa Monica, basically, people pay for the privilege because of the feeling that the city has prioritized sort of the turnaround time on permits. Whenever they haven't, it's basically come back to bite them. Culver City's issue is just in terms of like the cost of operating. If you look at it from real estate square footage, from the overall from the use tax costs and stuff like that, that's relatively high. The main thing is that business taxes, there's some room to, but if you go to El Segundo, you have a much lower sales tax, a lower use tax, and a lower business tax. Now, El Segundo, by the way, is basically the king in LA County of doing that. But the main thing is that you just want to be mindful of is that I'm expecting if a business tax proposition goes on the ballot, there's a very good chance it'll pass, especially if it's defined where the money is going, because of the fact that people are aware of some of the issues. But that being said, is that can sort of happen once, and then people become a lot more skeptical, especially if they see businesses choose to move out or they see other issues that happen. And that's why it's always a balancing act, because businesses can relocate right across the border. And that was always the gamble when LA raised the minimum wage before anybody else, because fortunately they had an idea that the state was going to do the same thing. But if the state hadn't, it would have been a real issue, because businesses could have just simply moved right across out of LA. And LA already actually has a significant issue that dates back to when they raised business and use taxes too high, where the overall number of people employed in Los Angeles has actually gone down. Actually went down basically from the early 2000s into even after the recovery from the recession, because a number of businesses basically said it was too expensive to operate, and they moved across the border, they moved out. And so it's just being mindful of that. I'm not, in this case, as I said, I haven't studied it enough to say one way or the other. That's why I said before, I'll say it again, and it's something obviously to look into, but I just say it's very mindful to do it. I mean, we just had a school construction bond that was put on the primary ballot that the state pushed, the governor pushed. It's failing, it's losing, because there is a certain limit at this point because that people are willing to do. So on the other hand, the sales tax extension in Culver City went through. So, because of the sense that people feel like they're getting what their value is. So it's just knowing the big issue that's going to happen between now and November, and that is going to be what's the economy look like and what are people willing to put up with. And that will ultimately determine it.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we're so proud of having Culver City residents that are so knowledgeable about all these issues. So we hope we will see you here at some other point, and maybe you participate in some of our general plan discussions further on, because that's going to be another 2 years probably. So we look forward to your commentary and opinions. So everyone, let's thank Mr.
Here's my card. I would like to sit down with you because I'm the economic guy in the council, and I find sometimes very uphill battles.